So the topic is about transitional justice and transitional justice in the region, in the Middle East and North Africa. Let me start first with some conceptualization about what's transitional justice. Basically, transitional justice is a justice system, right? Judicial and non-judicial, that process that's established during times of political transitions in order to respond to the crimes, human rights violations that were committed during times of war, that current laws are not able to respond to these crimes and human rights violations that were committed during times of war. So that's why we need this transitional justice, is a law that can be established during political transitions to be able to track the violations that we will see examples today that happened 30 and 40 years ago that current laws cannot address. Right? So the first time actually where this, which is now a science in transitional justice, is taught in many other places, started in Latin America. Right, Latin America, where political transitions were happening, and they were encountered with these questions: how do current justice laws respond to these crimes that happened in the past? So it was impossible, and then it started to emerge this concept of political transition and establishing laws that are happening there. And just actually, thank you. And just actually a month ago, I was in Colombia, in Latin America, where one of those field visits that I make to conflict zones, and a peace agreement was signed in 2016 for the war that started in 1964 back in Colombia. And I met with the committee, national committee, now charged with establishing a transitional justice law in order to address again the crimes that happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and all of that. So that's where it started. And the importance of transitional justice in a recent, not very recent actually, study from UNDP showed that now peace agreements, 60% of peace agreements, they have special chapters for transitional justice, which was not the case few decades ago because it was not the transitional justice as part of political transitions. So there is a more and a stronger awareness of the importance and the significance of the transitional justice as a key factor to facilitate peaceful transitions from one regime to another, right? And we will see many examples today of how the Arab world, Arab countries got it wrong on the concept of justice, right? And transitional justice during political transitions, and how sadly they ended up in, again, renewed violence, civil wars, and brutal wars happening there. So what is transition? What does it include, transitional justice? When I met back in 2012, I think, with the Minister of Justice in Tunisia, Salim Dilo, and I asked him this question: what is transitional justice that you're doing in Tunisia? He said, when we started researching this question, what is transitional justice? He said, we found 40 different definitions of transitional justice. It's an evolving field, right? So there isn't one definition or what it includes, transitional justice, as there are many important elements of political transitions that need to be addressed during times of war. However, among all these different definitions, transitional justice usually includes three key factors. One is knowing what happened in the past, unveiling the truth, right? Knowing what happened in the past. And second, victim redress, or the compensation for for the victims that they suffered during times of war. And 3, accountability. Holding those who committed the crimes against humanity, human rights violations, responsible for the crimes that they committed. And a 4th element also is usually included in this definition, which is very important, talking about institutional reform. So reforming the institutions in a way that prevents the reoccurrence of the crimes that happened in the past. So you lock it into the structures, to the institutions, in order to ensure it will not happen again. As expected in many conflict zones, politicization or taking advantage or using or manipulating justice, the question of justice, is something very common, and we will see examples. So this is something to expect about the politicization of transitional justice and how parties use it to serve their own agendas. Sometimes called selective justice instead of transitional justice. Sometimes we end up with vindictive justice, العدالة الانتقامية and الانتقالية, right? So the 2 concepts instead of transitional justice that serves the purpose. When it starts after times of transition. So in the concept of, since we're talking political transitions, once a war is over and we start a political transition, as we're seeing in the entire region during the Arab Spring, we're stuck with massive tasks that we need to sort out during those political transitions. So this shows, the challenges and the massive tasks that countries facing or undergoing political transition that have to respond to and to dealing with. So I did some sort of a mapping of these tasks that they are in 4 different categories, right? And where transitional justice is in this kind of political transition. So if we look at this over here, we see that transitional justice, right, is at the core of it, right, as a starting point in order to deal with the different layers of transitions that, again, political systems that are going through. So transitional justice, truth-seeking, reparation, and accountability, the 3 major elements of transitional justice. Then another layer, if we start talking about refugees, lustration, DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, and the IDPs, internally displaced populations, how to deal with them. And then there is the 3rd layer, is about reconstruction, post-war reconstruction, elections, rebuilding infrastructures, education reforms, and all of that. And if we're successful, we can probably reach, like some countries have reached this, is that not only post-conflict reconstruction, but also post-conflict development, where you start building a stronger economy, and that where is the entire transition is complete. So let's do this. Truth-seeking, what happened in the past, right? So it's a key question in order that we are faced with in political transition of why do we need to know, or do we need to know what happened in the past? And this is a huge question in the literature and of conflict resolution, of whether we should start going back and digging about what happened in the past, or just forget about the past. 2 different schools, right? Or just let's focus, as some argue, focus on the present and move forward, right? Forget about what happened in the past. Now, is this the way to go forward? According to transitional justice and in the field of conflict resolution, that's a huge mistake, right? Because you cannot build the present and the future without or being disconnected or not linked to key factors that happened, or to what happened in the past. And let me share with you this picture. This picture that I took in 2012 from Libya. If you heard about the Abu Salim prison massacre that happened in 1996, basically, that 1,270 were executed in 2 hours, basically prisoners, that they demanded improvement of their conditions, and they were killed by the Gaddafi regime in 2 hours. And no one knew anything about them until 6 or 7 years later, right? Where families of the prisoners were thinking that they were still in prison. And they would go to the prison, there were no visits, and they would send their food and clothes to their relatives years after that, thinking that they were still alive. But then they discovered later that they were killed all a long time ago. So what happened in the Abu Salim prison massacre, right? So this is one of the big questions. And in every conflict, you will find many of those questions, unanswered questions about the truth, right? And what happened. The victims, their families, they are entitled, and it's their right to know what happened to their relatives. And society's political transition cannot move forward, right, with those what's called forced disappearance or not knowing about what happened. And this remains an open wound. Unless you deal with it, you give some comfort to the families. You help them with the healing process in order to be able to move forward. Otherwise, the question of what happened in the past, listen to this, keeps the society divided about two narratives, two national narratives about what to make of the times of the Gaddafi time, right? Or what to make of the Omar al-Bashir's time, or what to make of the Ali Abdullah Saleh's times in Yemen, and all the big questions. If these questions are not answered, then we end up with two narratives, a structurally divided society that will not help us move forward without knowing about the truth. So that's why I wanted to see, you would see this picture. These pictures are people, they're not numbers. Usually you read in the literature, 1,217 were killed. These are people, they have families, they have relatives, they're not numbers. There are people who are still thinking about their relatives. And unless you provide some comfort to their families and you address what happened to them, we end up with a society remain divided. And providing a platform for renewed violence in the future, because again, we do not have a definition. We do not have the truth about what happened to those people in the past. And like this, there are hundreds of examples. There's also if you take the Libya time, the plane that crashed from Benghazi to Tripoli, also still during the 90s, that we still don't know what happened to it. And there are many, many other examples. So knowing truth-seeking and knowing the truth, when I was doing my research, field research in Yemen, Libya, and Tunisia, I asked my interviewees in Yemen, do you want to know what happened in the past? Do you want to know the truth about what happened in the past? And I found that many of them were saying, let's forget about the past. Okay, and let's move forward. Let's focus on we are a tribal society. If we know the truth, then it will have renewed tension and violence. So it's better to focus on moving forward. So it makes sense. So I went to Libya, right? And I asked the same question to the people that I'm interviewing. Do you want to know what happened to us? They said, we want to know every single piece of information. The whole truth. about the past. Very interesting, because again, I'm getting different answers. And then I go to Tunisia and I ask the same question. Do you want to know what happened during the Bourguiba and Ben Ali in the past? And then I get some different answers. Some would say yes, and others would say no. Right? So as a conflict resolution specialist, studying the literature, and that's why it's so important to go to the field and test the theories and what you read in the literature, because you'll find so many interesting answers in the field, the real world. Right? So I struggled with these questions because the literature, again, like when I started talking to you about transitional justice, all emphasize important to know, and then I find people saying, no, we don't want to know. Right? So what is the answer to this? Why is there different answers that I'm getting, in here? And when I started in the first slide talking about the politicization of transitional justice. Yes. So basically, each one was responding to their own political agenda. Right? Like in Yemen, why they don't want to know, or the people that I asked, is that the crimes and the violations that happened in the past, actually everyone was involved. It wasn't only Saleh's regime, but the opposition also were part of this. Like during the 1994 war, for example, which where the major violations happened, the opposition, the Islah and others, were part of the government. So if you start digging, right, about what happened in the 1994 war in Yemen, so it's not only that Saleh who's going to be in trouble, but everyone will. So here you find both the regime and the opposition say, oh, let's forget about this. Right? But then in Libya, because in Libya it was a zero-sum end to the regime of Gaddafi. When one loses, right, then the winners, right, or the victorious justice, right, the victorious that they want to implement their own version of truth and their own version of justice, then they demand the full truth, right, because also it serves their own agenda. The Gaddafi regime was all taken out. So again, it's responding to how this is serving their own also political agenda. But what about Tunisia? Right? Tunisia, again, it was a mix. Right? The regime remained, or those who were in the Hizb al-Dasturi party, they remained in Tunis, or actually was headed by Sibsi, right? And his party that became a major party, that were part of the regime in the past, Ibn Ali and Bourguiba. So they did not want in any way, right, to start talking about the past. But the Islamists, right, and the socialists who were who suffered mainly during the times of, and they were never part of the government, they wanted to know. Right? So again, it depends where you stand. And then we remain confused about what to do. Now, the other question that you will face with when you start talking about knowing the truth about the past, how far do we want to go? Like in Yemen, do we want to go to the Arab Spring, 2011? To the wars that the Houthis fought against the central government in 2004, right? Or to the 1994, the war between the South and the North. Or to the 1986, right? The internal war within the South, socialist country. Or to the 1978, when Saleh came to power. And by the way, talking about the truth and the forced disappearance, there are still today politicians, or especially from the Ba'ath Party in 1978 in Yemen, that disappeared when Saleh came to power, no one knows anything about them until today. Right? So these remain one of the questions also, in that no answer to it. Right? So then that becomes the struggle. So each party will want to know, to go back to the starting point that it serves, again, their own agenda, right, on that level. And then, where do we draw the line? Same thing in Libya, you'll find many different starting points. Same thing you'll find in Tunisia, right, where you have different starting points, and each one represents something. In Tunisia, they solved it by going back to 1956, not just to the times of Ben Ali, but also to the times of Bourguiba. So let's continue to the other major key element of transitional justice, which is about the victims' redress and the compensation for the victims who suffered during times of war. And during those times, you will find massive violations that happened during the past. Now, the first question, do we have the resources to respond to the violations that happened in Sudan during the war with the South, for example, or in Yemen to the 1986 war or the 1994 war? When Saleh came to power, or in 1994, when the war ended and Saleh captured the South, he fired 20, 30,000, right, from the army without any, from the Southern Army, without any compensation, without anything. So who's going to compensate them for the times, right, and for losing, and took many resources in the South, and all of that? We don't have we have the challenge of, again, the issue of the resources. But now the other question is, the other important question, does really money solve everything? No. Of course not. Right? The picture that we saw of the Abu Salim prison massacres, right, in Libya in 1996, can really money address the pain that their mothers and their sisters and their relatives and their brothers and their fathers went through? Can money solve this? They cannot. And if you look at this picture, where I was meeting with political prisoners who spent 10 years, 15 years, 20 years in Tunisia during the times of Bali in prison. Right? And when the regime collapsed, they were released, of course, from prison. But you can imagine what someone that spent 20 years in jail, what education or master's degrees like you guys, right, they don't have master's degrees, they don't have bachelor's degrees, they don't have education. What are they going to do? And the people who suffered and paid the price during Ben Ali times and during Bourguiba times, while others were attending the London School of Economics, right, and in US universities, elite universities, that they became ministers, and right, while those people were in prison, right, and paying the price and being tortured, right, by different types of torture by the regime. So in Tunisia, what they offered them jobs that they don't require skills, basically. But these are like low-paying jobs, like gardeners, right? And you can imagine, for those who struggled and fought against repression, right, in Tunisia, they end up being gardeners, and those that were attending the London School of Economics, they had nothing to do with the whole thing. They became the ministers. So these questions to the prisoners of what you do with them, right? They have the just and right cause for all what they went through, but then how are you going to respond to them? Now, one of the solutions that they wanted to do is hire them in the state, in the bureaucratic system, right, of the state, in the government. But then the challenge, right, first of all, is about whether they have right qualifications or not. But also, in Tunisia, we had a different type of challenge, that those who were tortured and suffered and spent times in prison, they come from mainly one political party, the Islamists, right? But then if you end up hiring them in the state, so then the Islamists are taking over the state, right? That becomes the narrative. Then what do you do? Right? So these questions, in terms of how to respond to the victims, the victims who paid the price and they suffered and they struggled against the regime, against the dictatorship, against repression, but you're unable to offer them what solutions that you want to give them, right, on that level. Take the Taif agreement in Lebanon. When the Taif agreement was signed, right, in 1989, 1990, it awarded or rewarded the warlords, right, the warlords, the ones that they were running the Lebanese civil war. They changed their military uniform, right, put on suits with ties and sat in the parliament. But we still have thousands of forced disappearances in the Lebanese civil war from the 70s and the 80s that we still don't know what happened to them. And their families, they're still paying the price every single day, with no closure, with no healing, right, with no justice for all those that they were murdered during the civil war. But the Taif agreement, the peace agreement, awarded or rewarded the warlords. And then you wonder, that's what it means to have an absence of a transitional justice, right, in political transitions, because the Taif agreement did not even say the word of transitional justice. Because the Taif agreement was mainly focusing on stopping the bloodshed, right? But what happened to that? Take the Oslo Accord, the Palestinians signed in 1993. Go back to this. Do you find anything about the Nakba, right? Or the massacres that were committed against the Palestinians before the 1993? There is no mentioning of any of this, right? So, again, as we see the case of Lebanon, that what we had, we stopped the bloodshed, but we ended up with a prolonged war or conflict, and the structure, the society is structurally divided. Not two narratives, as you said, with many different narratives, national narratives about what happened during the Lebanese civil war. Okay. Take the other important key factor about accountability. So now the question is, what do you do with the former regime? What do we do with the Omar al-Bashir's regime? But what do we do with Saleh's regime? What do we do with Saddam Hussein's regime? What do we do with the Gaddafi regime? And so forth. Now, unfortunately, on this question, most of the cases, they went to the extremes. Meaning, the case of Iraq and Libya, right, ended up with the approach, the purge approach, what's called, which is entirely punishing the entire former regime, right, purging the entire state from anyone that who served with the former regime. Like in Libya, they approved in the parliament, right, what's called the قانون العزل السياسي, right, political isolation law, which means anyone, even if you were working as an ambassador for Libya in the Philippines, for example, then you are prevented from taking any role in the new Libya. Even if you were working in the education department, you're prevented from any role in the new Libya. Right? And same thing in Iraq, where Paul Bremer, right, dissolved the entire Iraqi army, right, one of the strongest armies in the region or in the world even during that time, dissolving the entire Iraqi army and also punishing, or what's called the de-Baathification, right, is like a cleansing or purging the entire system from anyone who belonged to the Ba'ath party. And if you're familiar with the case of Iraq, without being in the Ba'ath party, a member, you wouldn't even be able to study like engineering or medicine. That was one of the admission requirements, is to be Ba'athist. Right? So that's the state that they had during Saddam. But then the de-Baathification comes and penalizes, right, the entire former regime. And in practice, what you're doing, you're sending the entire regime to the opposition, and basically you're launching a new civil war. And that's exactly what happened. Right? In 2013 in Libya, when I was discussing with the advocates of the political isolation law, right, which is again purging the entire system, I was giving them the example of Iraq, because I told them this political isolation law is the other form of de-Baathification in Iraq, and you will end up with a civil war. And they would say, no, we're different from Iraq. Right? By the way, all conflict zones in the world, everyone tells you, oh, no, we are different. Right? You are not different. And there, some of them would even be offended. Why are you comparing us to Iraq? Iraq is a sectarian society. We're not. We're all Arab, Sunni, Maliki even. And I said, my friend, that does not help you. When you send an entire regime to the opposition, right, you're dividing the society and you're pushing them to fight you back. And I remember at the time, I wrote a piece in the New York Times alerting to the political isolation law and how it's setting up the country for a civil war, right? It was adopted, sadly.
2012.
Yes. Yeah. And in 2014, thank you, Doctor, 2014 emerged one of the former regime elements, Khalifa Haftar, and regrouped, many around him, and then good luck with that. He's not Sunni, Shia, whatever, right? He's just from the former regime. And he's going to defend, right, and to try to push back, right? So that's again the question, what do we do with the former regime? So we have the extreme case of purging the system like Iraq and Libya. But then in Yemen and Lebanon, we move to the other extreme, which is what? Rewarding the oppressor, thank you, Dr. Mustafa, which is no accountability. Right. So in Yemen, what we did in the GCC initiative that provided the framework for the transition, the political transition, is giving immunity against prosecution of Saleh or the entire regime or anyone with him. And not all of this, all the money that you took in the past, you were stealing, it's all yours. Right? So amnesty, entire amnesty, total amnesty in the case of Yemen, right? And in the case of Lebanon as well. No one, so it was an absence of the concept of accountability, an absence of a transitional justice. And sadly, in both cases, in Yemen and in Lebanon, we ended up with a prolonged conflict as well. So that's, in my view, the major struggle that the Arab world faces when it comes to political transition. And sadly, like, we developed this pattern of either going to the extreme and changing transitional justice, right, to become selective justice or vindictive justice, عدالة انتقامية, retaliation, revenge, right? And that's why we execute Saddam on the first day of the Eid, as if there are no 364 days of the year to do that, right? Which is the day of Eid al-Adha. So that's how the struggle with it. What we need, actually, we don't need the extremes. What's needed, actually, there is a good practice of Tunisia, and we have from Morocco here, and also in Morocco, that they were balanced about, again, taking a different approach, which is the transitional justice approach that you are studying here. So what happened is that in the case of Tunisia, the former regime, right, only those individuals, not the party, individuals who were directly linked to committing violations were held accountable. The individuals. That someone who tortured in his own hands, in the intelligence, for example, right? Not the entire Dusturi party, that again was half of the people from in the Dusturi party, right? The former regime, the former ruling party, but the individuals in the intelligence who tortured, who killed, were held accountable. And actually, like, I remember the statistics during that time, they came like to around 120 people, right, in Tunisia. So those, actually, they did not even take their assets. They put their assets, they froze them, right? And anyone even who was able to prove that the money, the assets, came from legitimate sources like inherited, they would release them, right? And established a transitional justice law like what Colombia is doing today and like what most Latin American countries did, and to try to dig about the truth, about the past, and to try those, again, who were involved in the crimes. Morocco, the example of Morocco, I encourage you also to look at it, which was a very smart move on the king's side when he came to power in 2004. He did not wait until to see the Arab Spring in 2010-11. In 2004, he came and he said, there are political grievances, there are victims. And the courage, to give him credit, those were committed under his father's times, his father's era. He recognized it, that there were grievances, they were victims, right? And started in 2004 the Truth and Justice, or the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, to try to, again, identify the grievances, try to, again, recognize them, acknowledge them, and also involves in compensation. Now, the case also of Morocco is not complete because it did not pursue accountability. It dealt with the first parts of the victims and the truth-seeking and victims redress, but not the accountability. But it's still better than nothing, right? So, which is one of the shortcomings of the Morocco experience. In the case of Tunisia, actually, there were apologies extended publicly, and if you remember, actually, victims would come on TV and talk about, what they suffered during the former regime. And the entire nation is listening to them. You cannot, my friend, move forward in a successful transition without recognizing and adequately responding to the victims and their grievances and what they went through. So in Tunisia, they came on TV and they talked to the nation that were listening during that time. So that's again where we have in the case of Libya, and it's the same, again, unlike in Libya and Iraq, where went to the extreme, and Yemen and Lebanon went to the other extreme. The last fact, the last element of transitional justice, again, that also must be adequately addressed, which is about institutional reform. In my conversation with one of the political prisoners in Tunisia, that he was tortured physically during the Ben Ali times, and suffered and spent times in prison and all that. So I asked him this question: what do you want for all what you went through? A job, money, right? Because now, again, as we said, is that how to satisfy, right, those grievances is a major challenge. So I asked him this question, and he said, I want only one thing. And I said, what is it? And he said, I want to make sure that what happened to me will not be repeated to my children and to the children of Tunisia. That's as far as I'm concerned. Right? So that's why, again, you cannot separate transitional justice, institutional reform, from transitional justice and political transitions. So in Tunisia, actually, which is a great, great, great experience, the case of Tunisia, right? And how they dealt with the transitional justice. They formed a committee against torture of political prisoners or prisoners in Tunisian prisons, which is again what Tunisia suffered from in the past. And this committee is entitled to visit any prison in Tunisia and to meet with the prisoners and ensure that torture is not happening there and they're not being tortured. So that's an example of the institutional reform we're talking about here, that establishing this kind of committee and giving it all the rights and privileges to enter any political prison, any prison in Tunisia, right? And the administration of the prison does not have the power or the right to prevent them, and meet with the prisoners and ensure they're not being tortured, like what happened in the past. Right? So, and of course you can imagine how much reform the old regime or the former regime needs in order to do that. In the case of Libya, again, like they wanted to fire all judges in Libya because they all served under the former regime. And they were like 1,800 judges.
And they didn't have no results.
So how would you do this? And I asked him, if you fire all the judges because they served under the former regime, these are the conversation in 2012 and 13. So how are you going to try those the criminals or the ones that served under the former regime? And there were questions like, we will bring judges from other Arab countries. We don't want them. But then the question, if you bring they don't understand the context, where you're going to provide security to them. There is no security in Libya, right? But then you end up with nothing, right? So which is again one of the questions of how to do this. In the case of Yemen and the case of Lebanon, right, no institutional reform whatsoever. Whatever was under the former regime remained under the former regime. So the entire regime transitioned peacefully to the new state. Right? And then what did you do actually? Where's the transition? Where's the reform? Right? So we ended up with the same exact regime. But in Iraq, again, you destroy the entire system. And you try to build a new one. But then, right, you end up with another civil war. So again, institutional reform is needed, my friends, in the area of not only justice, the justice system. Take, for example, the education system. Education where all praising the leader and the president and all of that. And also the Minister of Information, media. They knew only one thing, is how to glorify the president. Right? So you need to reform this as well. The administrative system, which was full of corruption, you also need to reform it. So basically you need to reform everything. Education, media, administration, the military, the security systems, that they were, but again, sadly, in countries like Yemen and Lebanon, none of that happened. So there is no institutional reform. So these are, again, am I on time? Okay, all right. So these are the four elements of a transitional justice, and with all the examples that how countries, they struggle with these concepts and how to deal with them. And unless, again, you address them, then your political transition will experience many other challenges. And that's why, again, we started to see more and more of laws in peace agreements, items in the peace agreement, again, emphasizing the need for a transitional justice law. Again, I go back to the case of Colombia, because in Colombia, the rebels and the government signed the peace agreement in 2016. They said, okay, we're ending a civil war, and we're starting a new chapter, power sharing, right? But power sharing, my friends, again, does not mean, right, that you forget about all what happened in the past. So the law, the transitional justice in Colombia that they are establishing, actually is giving an opportunity for the perpetrators, right, for those who commit crimes, is to come clean. Also, accountability does not mean, right, mass executions. Because in the case of Rwanda, after the genocide, and wanted to try those who were involved, they ended up in the prisons and the courts of hundreds of thousands of people. So what do? How do you try all these people? Right. So what you do, there are different ways, like of the perpetrators, recognizing the wrongdoing of what they did, and apologizing for the people about what they did, and actually some community service that they do to give back to the society. And instead of spending 20 years in a prison, you would spend 5 years, for example, apologizing, recognizing, serving the community. And then this is an opportunity, by the way, I would like you to remember this. Transitional justice provides an opportunity not only for the victims, but equally importantly for the perpetrators, for those who committed the crimes, is to cleanse themselves from all the wrongdoings that they committed against others, is to try to, again, instead of spending 20 years in prison, 25 years, 5 years, and community service, and apologizing for the victims and their families, and you come clean again, right, after you go all through this process. So I end with this: transitional justice is important for the victim, is important for the society, is important for the political transition, and equally importantly, is important for the perpetrator, which they should realize that it's giving them an opportunity is to go back to the society and to clean themselves from the crimes that they committed and all the wrongdoings that they did to others. And with that, I end and thank you for